Good morning. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Randy Richter. I'm just a part of this congregation here. I'm not on staff or anything, but your pastor just kindly asked me a while back. He said, "Would you like to preach July 15th?" He said, "We won't pay you anything like a stipend. It's just going to be your gift to the church." And I was like, "Sure, I'd love to do that." Well, I'm going to be glad to get this over with today. I'm going to tell you why. So 2 weeks ago, I got married. And thank you. And then immediately headed off to Mexico for my honeymoon. Spent my honeymoon in a place called the Sincan Biosphere, which is a national park in Mexico. It's basically beyond the middle of nowhere, in a treehouse on the beach. But guess what I dreamed about on my honeymoon? I kept having a recurring dream. Every night I had this dream. In my dream, I would wake up and it was Monday. And I had forgotten to come here and preach. I had that dream like 4 times. I know, it's awful. So, I'm here. It's the right day. Let's do this. I want you to think about, perhaps just very briefly, all of us have times in our lives, stories that we'll never forget, good or bad. And I'm going to tell you one of mine. I was at Ellis Park. Most of you have been there, right? We're Cedar Rapids people. We're familiar with that. I was fishing on the south side of Ellis Park, kind of over by the gardens, and it was just, to me, one of those beautiful summer evenings. It was warm and humid and still. I had already caught a 12-pound catfish on a fly rod. I mean, it was great. It was perfect, and it was quiet. And then suddenly it wasn't. There was a large group of bikers pulled in, probably 40, 50 people. And when I say bikers, I don't mean like a bunch of accountants that were out for a bike ride after work, because they're bikers too, but I mean people that were part of some, I don't remember what gang or affiliate it was, but they were all part of the same thing, and they pulled in and set up shop and brought out their coolers. And, you know, there was lots of hair and lots of tattoos and lots of crude talk, and it got really loud. And I thought, you know what? I had a nice night. I think I'm going to head out. I walked up to my car, and I was putting my stuff in the trunk, and this is the part of this message where I'm going to risk sounding crazy. I guess I just want to give you I want to say, there's just been very few times in my life where I've just felt like God was speaking to me directly. Okay, it doesn't happen to me all the time. I don't wake up and God doesn't say, "Hey, brush your teeth with Crest today." But I was at the car, and I just knew God spoke to me. Again, I'm sorry if that sounds crazy, and you know what he said? He said very clearly, "I want you to go talk to them." And I actually spoke out loud and said back, "What do you want me to say?" I didn't get an answer on that. But I just had a very powerful impression that I was supposed to go over there and talk. And so you remember the prophet Isaiah where he said, "Here am I, send me," and he was all happy about it? That wasn't me. I was like, all right, if you've ever told your kid to go do something and they don't really want to do it, but they know the consequences are greater if they don't, and they kind of go, "All right, I'll go do it." So I walked over there with no idea like what in the world this was supposed to be. And I don't remember exactly how it all came together, but it took a while, but suddenly there's probably 20 of us, and we're just all sitting together talking. And it was just, you know, they'd seen me catch the big fish, so they asked me about that. And then all of a sudden, just like the most natural thing in the world, we started talking about church. And then we started talking about faith. And then people are just telling their stories. Like men and women, and they're telling stories, and a few tears were shed. And I talked with a few of them that had just shared real personal stories and just said, I'll be praying for you. And I walked back to the car, and I got in my car, and I just thought, wow, what was that? And I don't know, I mean, what happened since then, and any kind of I never talked to any of those people ever again. But I can tell you this, and this is a free part of this message that has nothing to do with the rest of the message. If God ever asks you to do something, just do it. I mean, just do it, even if it sounds a little crazy, and you won't regret it. Now, as they shared their stories with me, I learned that most of them that shared those stories had some regrets. They were not in a place in life where they had planned on. They were not in a place in life that was originally anywhere where they could have seen themselves ending up. It wasn't because of one decision that they were where they were. I would say that they would probably say to you that what had happened was that they had drifted. They'd started in one place, they had some goals, and then they drifted. Here's the definition of the word drifting. The definition of the word drifting is to float or to be pushed along as if by the wind. Okay, so when you drift, you don't have a lot of intent. The people in the Old West that went from town to town and from job to job were called what? Drifters. You get out and you drive on the road. A lot of the crazy things that you see on the road from other people in their cars are a result of them letting their attention what? Drift. When you drift, you end up in places you don't want to be in, but you may not even be aware of it. It's the primary cause of regret, often is drifting. Now, before we read the scripture, we're going to have a moment of just some extraordinary honesty that will help us with the rest of this message. Okay? How many of you would say, I'm in the best place that I've ever been spiritually in my life? My walk with Jesus is the best that it has ever been, and that's a great thing that I am super happy for you about. If that's the case, just raise your hand. I'm just kind of curious. And that is awesome. How many of you would say, keep your hands down right now, how many of you would say there is a time in my past where I was spiritually at a better place than I am now? Where my walk with Jesus was just, my spiritual relationship with Jesus Christ was maybe better than it is right now. If you have a little guts and would just be really honest, just raise your hand if that's the case. Okay, if that's the case, then you've drifted a little bit. Is that fair to say? And you may not be in a bad place right now. I'm really shocked that you guys were so honest, by the way. Thank you. You may not be in a bad place right now, but I want to say that there's probably something better for you. So if you have your scriptures, and I'll have it on the screen to turn with me to John chapter 21. I'm all excited about this story, okay? John chapter 21. Kind of a long scripture, but I'd like you to kind of picture the scene in your mind, too, as it's read. Okay, this is after the resurrection, but Jesus has disappeared for a little while. It says, after these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he manifested himself in this way. There were together Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two of his disciples. Pay a lot of attention to this verse. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, we will also come out with you. And they went out, and they got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. I wonder what that's like. When the day was breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus therefore said to them, children, you do not have any fish, do you? And they answered him, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find a catch. And they cast therefore, and they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. The disciple therefore whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. And so when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, and he threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land. They were about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. And when they got out upon the land, they saw charcoal already laid, and fish placed on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you've caught. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of large fish, 153. Although there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples ventured to question him, who are you? Knowing that it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave them the fish likewise. This is the third time he was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So, when they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, feed my lamb, tend my lambs. And he said to him again, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, shepherd my sheep. And he said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, I say to you, when you were younger and used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished, but when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go. Now this he said, signifying what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. All right, this whole passage just really interests me. So Peter is out after a very discouraging night of fishing, because what's the point of fishing ultimately? To actually catch fish. I once had a couple from India that moved here, and they asked me, they had never been fishing, and they asked me to teach them to fish. And so I took them to a place where 3 days ago I had caught like 50 fish in a couple hours, and I told them that, unfortunately. And we caught the same amount of fish Peter did. We caught 0. Now, I have to imagine for Peter, it was more discouraging because he's a professional and I'm an amateur. But what I want you to understand is the problem really wasn't that Peter didn't catch any fish. The problem was that he was fishing in the first place. Does that make sense? 3 years ago, Jesus had come to Peter and basically said to him, follow me. You used to fish for fish, and now you're going to fish for men. It was a huge moment in Peter's life. He was given a new name. His name used to be Simon, and Jesus said, now I'm going to call you Peter, which means rock. Now, was Peter actually a rock at that time? No, he was temperamental and impulsive and undependable, but But Jesus, just like he does with us, he saw Peter as he could be, not just as he was. And he gave him a new name, and he said, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I'll rebuild my church." Now we have a little bit of an advantage. We know the future, and in the future, Peter was that rock. This was a guy that stood before crowds and preached, and thousands of people made decisions to follow Christ in a day. He preached before kings. He spoke boldly. He spoke truly. He never backed down from anything. That was the Peter of Acts. But the Peter of John had drifted. The Peter of John really didn't know what was happening. Peter of John felt a little bit abandoned by Jesus. And the Peter of John began to think of his life before his calling as the good old days. And so, as he longed for those days and not a future with Jesus, he pulls the little boat out of storage. He says to the other disciples, he says, "I'm going fishing." And he's a leader, so the other disciples follow him, and he hits the lake. And I want you to see that as a big deal when Peter decides that he's going fishing. It's not like when you or I do it. And like I said, we already know that Peter made it back. But I don't want to be ominous, but I do want to say that not everybody that drifts makes it back. And Judas was a disciple. He was one of the 12. He had potential and gifts and a love of Jesus. He didn't suddenly become the betrayer. He got dissatisfied. He got bitter. The person he never discussed it with, probably, Jesus. And finally, he made the decision everybody remembers him for, but I don't think he ever meant to end up there. I've watched a lot of people drift. Some of them made it back. Some of them so far have not. And so when Peter made this decision to go fishing, Jesus took it really, really seriously. And I want to take a look at, real briefly, the process that Jesus used to kind of move Peter back. And the first thing that Jesus wants Peter to do is he wants him to remember. And you would think that Peter would remember things that were really important, but here's one thing I've noticed about humanity. We have an extraordinary ability to forget important stuff. I mean, I could tell you 1,000 stories, and this is from a guy that loses his keys almost daily. But how many of you have forgotten something really important before? Made an appointment and blown it off, or forgotten, an anniversary or something that really mattered to somebody else. So Jesus wants Peter to remember, and we see the story here. So they're floating out on the water with exactly the same amount of fish that they started with, and there's a lone figure walking on the beach, and he shouts to them, "Any luck?" Because as a fisherman, I'm just going to tell you, if you haven't caught any fish, somebody's going to walk by and ask you how you did. That's how it always works. When you catch 20, nobody ever asks. But when you've caught none, there's always that guy. And so this stranger shows up on the beach, says, "How many fish have you caught?" "None." "Throw your net over on the other side of the boat." And they come up with a big net full of fish, and John says to Peter, "It's the Lord." And Peter jumps off the boat like it's the Olympics. And swims, it says it's about 100 yards. He swims 100 yards to shore. Why the rush? Because this is a repeat miracle. It's almost exactly the same. 3 years ago, Jesus stepped into Peter's boat and used it as a platform to teach. And when he was done, he said to Peter, hey, how many fish you catch last night? Peter said, we didn't do that great. Actually, none. And Jesus said, put your water in the deep water and let the nets down. And we're told in the Bible when they'd done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and the nets began to break. And so they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they filled their nets, and there were so many fish, the boats began to sink. That's a good trip. Peter was fearful. He wanted Jesus just to go away. And Jesus said to Peter, he said, from now on, you'll be catching men. And so what Jesus is doing is Jesus is intentionally taking Peter on a walk down memory lane, taking him to the place where it all began, taking him to the place where he was first called. And again, for you, there was probably that time when you just were really first called, and that you would think that would be in the forefront of your memory, but like I said, we have an outstanding ability to let things fade away. But for Jesus, it was so important to bring Peter back to this that he elaborately staged a return to his first calling. And he just asked him to remember. And then secondly, Jesus asked Peter to compare. He says to Peter, he says, do you love me more than these? Now, that phrase is a little unclear, okay? And in my own study Bible, and some of the ones you have, say that Jesus was speaking to Peter and he was asking him to look at the other disciples and saying, do you love me more than these? I just want to say to you that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, okay? Because if you remember right, the disciples were ultra competitive. I mean, they were always having discussions about, okay, when we all go to heaven, who's going to sit closest to Jesus? Who does Jesus like the best? Who's the fastest? No, I don't know about that. But these are ultra competitive people. And what I note is when they had those discussions, Jesus didn't like it. He usually ended up with a foot washing or a lecture or a sermon. Why would Jesus say, hey, Peter, in their presence, do you love me more than these guys? So there's another that a minority of scholars take and that just makes so much more sense to me given the whole context of the story, that Jesus is pointing to this big pile of 153 fish. And he's saying, Peter, do you love me more than these? And he's not talking about fish. He's talking about the whole thing. He's talking about the nets and the boats, and he's talking about Peter's life without him before Jesus. And he's saying, Peter, do you love me more than these? He wants him to compare. One of the things I like about my job, I'm a realtor, is that I get to meet some really interesting people. And a while back, Bill and Pat Gosnell asked me to help sell their home. And by the way, just a little aside, and I brought this up before, I just think they're great, okay? So if you ever say anything bad about them around me, I will fight you. I just want to let you know. I know that's not Nazarene-approved activity, but I will fight you, and then I'll apologize for it later on, okay? So early on, their house came in the market and got like 3 or 4 offers, like on the second day. And so what we did was, we sat down and we put all those offers on a table. They came over to my little office and we put them on a piece of paper and we said, okay, here's the first one, here's the second one, here's the third one. I don't remember whether there were 3 or 4, but whatever there were. And this one will net you this much money and this one will net you this much money. What did we do? We compared, right? We just said, let's decide which one is the best one. because we have to make a decision, okay? And that's exactly what Jesus did with Peter here. Here I am, and here's this. Do you love me more than these? And what I'd like you to remember is Jesus is almost never the safe choice, but he's always the best choice. When I was a little kid, I'm be so glad to get this off my ear. When I was a little kid, I used to watch a show called Wild Kingdom. Are there any old people that remember that show? Okay. Lots of old people that remember that show. And on that show, they went to a place called the Amazon jungle. I remember when I was like 5 or 6 watching that, and there were snakes there that were 20 feet long. I'm a nature guy. For me, that's great, okay? There were butterflies of every color of the rainbow. There were spiders so big that they hunted birds. And I remember when I was a kid thinking, man, I'm going to go to the Amazon jungle someday. I grew up. I became a fly fisherman, and I heard about this fish called a peacock bass that was so neon bright and like one of the strongest fish in the world. And you know where it lived? The Amazon jungle. And I thought, man, I'm going to go to the Amazon jungle someday. Last December, I went to the Amazon jungle. And I didn't catch a peacock bass. I caught 400 peacock bass while I was down there. You can go ahead and put that slide up there. That's what they look like. They're interesting. All right? But that's not my primary memory. Yeah, you can take that horrible picture of me off there now. The fish is cool. I look like I'm on sedatives. But while I was there, when you went through the line at night to eat, I was staying at, and by the way, I was 200 miles from the nearest road where we stayed. You had 3 choices, though, in food every night. And on one of my last nights there, I walked through the line. The first choice was chicken and black beans. I mean, that's good, right? The second choice was beef stroganoff. And the third choice was whole fried piranhas. I loaded up my plate with whole fried piranhas. That's them. That's the before picture. And then here's the after picture. That's all that was left, because they were so good. They were like the best fish that I'd ever had in my life. If you invite me over to your house and you have ribeye steak and lobster and piranhas, I'm going to take the piranhas every time, because, you know, the safe choice isn't always the best choice. So think of that little question I asked you at the beginning of the message. I said, how many of you, you're just at the top of things right now? It's as good as it's going to get. And some of you raised your hands, and I'm super happy about that. And I said, how many of you would say there's a time in your past that's a little better than it is now? And boy, a lot of you raised your hands. I've listened to a lot of sermons where at the end of the message, the pastor asked people to recommit their lives to Christ. And to be honest, that used to bother me a little bit, because I would always think, you know what? That phrase, recommitting your life to Christ, it's never in the Bible, right? It doesn't exist anywhere. But I've come to realize that the concept is all over the Bible. Because in this story, that's exactly what Jesus asked Peter to do. He basically said, once you were committed to me, remember that? Now you're not so committed to me. And then he said to him, do you really love me more than these? And he showed him where he had drifted to. And then he asked, he said, would you like to come back? Will you follow me? I want to close with just a few questions. And I'd really like you to think, I'd like you to put yourself in that place, if you would, because you are, I just want to let you know, you're just as important to Jesus as Peter was. First question is, are you still carrying out, and we might have a slide for this or we might not, are you still carrying out the original call that Jesus has given you? Second question, are there some things in your life that have distracted you from following Jesus, caused you to drift? The third question is, what would it take to put them in their proper place? And the last question is, if Jesus is calling you to stop drifting wherever it is you're drifting to, are you willing to respond to that? I thought about how I wanted to close this message and ask people to respond. And, honestly, there's almost no way to do that without it being awkward, is there? But since you guys were all so honest earlier, maybe we can get past some of that. And so here's, I think, how I want to, I better not try to leap off the stage. I could hurt myself. Here's how I think I want to handle that. I have in my hand some goldfish crackers. I wanted to go out and catch 153 real fish and put them in a big pile here, but there were some logistical challenges with that. But here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Like I said, could be awkward. I could end up standing here. I'm okay with that. But if you've kind of looked at this message with Peter, and you've really felt maybe a longing to return to someplace you've already been, if you feel like you've drifted and God just is speaking to you a little bit and simply asking you maybe to evaluate some things that have distracted you and take some return steps, sometimes I think there's some real value in doing something concrete that cements that just a little bit. And so I'm just going to give you a little memento. And if you just feel, I guess, if you would want to say, look, I feel like I've drifted a little bit. I feel like where I am is not where I want to be. And I want to be open at least to taking some steps towards returning where I should be. I can't tell you exactly what those steps are, but I'm just going to ask that you walk forward, be a little bit brave. There's no nice music playing or anything else. I'm not going to sing because you don't want that. But I'm just going to ask that you step forward and just, this is something between you and I, so I know and so I can pray for you. I'm just going to ask that you come up and take a goldfish cracker from me and return to your seat. If you're feeling that brave. You guys are my favorite group ever. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Father, I thank you for just the real honesty of your people today. It's impressive. I think probably at some point in our lives we all drift. And I think every single time you call us back. I'm glad today could be one of those times. I pray that for each person here, those that came forward and those that didn't, that as they think what's distracted me, that you would lead them back and show them the steps to take. Pray this in the name of Jesus, amen. For our benediction today, I'd like to read to you 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 16. And it says, "Now may the Lord of peace himself continually grant you peace in every circumstance. The Lord be with you all." Have a great week.